My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. Our guest is Representative Brian Newberry, a Republican representing District 48, which includes North Smithfield and part of Burrillville. He was first elected in November 2008, and he served as the House Minority Leader from May 2011 through November 2016. He now serves on the House Labor Committee, the House Oversight Committee, the House Rules Committee, and the House State Government and Elections Committee. He is a practicing attorney. Welcome to State of the State.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
As you may know, this program has run a three-part series on whether critical race theory and its companion critical gender theory are being introduced and taught in Rhode Island schools. Guests have indicated that Providence, South Kingstown, and North Kingstown are among the districts affected. Westerly and Exeter West Greenwich are other school systems where speakers have alleged these subjects are part of the curricula. Representative Newberry, one of these guests on our program includes your colleague, Representative Patricia Morgan, who introduced House Bill 6070 last session that would prohibit the teaching that one race or gender is superior to another, and that the United States is a racist society. Representative Morgan said the House Education Committee Chairman, Joseph McNamara, allowed the other committee members, when the bill was being heard, all Democrats, an opportunity to belittle her personally. Do you care to comment on Representative Morgan's allegation on this program? Have you heard it before?
I have not. I haven't spoken to her in over 4 years, so I have no idea what she's talking about.
Okay.
Don't know. I'm not saying it happened or didn't happen. I have no idea. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, her House Bill 6070 would prohibit, quote, teaching divisive concepts and making any individual feel discomfort, guilty, anguish, or distress on account of their race or sex. Any idea why the Democrats would be opposed to such a bill?
Well, let me back up. That bill, I actually do remember looking at that bill because I got some press attention, and it's so broadly worded, I don't even know how you can enforce it. I understand what she's trying to do. I don't disagree with the intent of it, but the bill itself was so poorly written. I mean, sometimes good ideas just get jumbled up, or that as written, that bill would be basically a violation of the First Amendment the way it's written. So
okay.
Conceptually, I agree with it, but the way that's written, no, you can't.
So it would be the Legislative Counsel's office that would be the one that actually drafted the language?
Yeah, I have no idea where that came from. Didn't come from our legal counsel, I can tell you that.
Okay. Last session, the legislature passed and the governor signed into law House Bill 5697 that requires the implementation of, quote, education courses in African American history in elementary and secondary schools in Rhode Island, commencing with the 2022-2023 school year. Previously, under previous Governor Gina Raimondo, a commission was created to develop a Black history curriculum for all public schools. So the curriculum had been provided by the state and is to be implemented in public schools in 2 years. Do you have any comment on that and which way this is going?
My memory of that bill is that it doesn't call for a specific course. It calls for the concepts to be taught, which makes sense. African American history is American history. And as long as it's woven into, as it should be, into a course in U.S. history, I think that's fine. Now, of course, a lot of these things, and I know we're going to talk later about civics education and things like that, a lot of things you have to remember is as a legislature, we can specify subjects that need to be taught. But the real nitty-gritty, and this is where people really need to pay attention, is at RIDE, that's Rhode Island Department of Education, is because RIDE will implement the details, and the local school districts will implement the details. For example, I have a pretty good handle on what's taught in my town. I have no idea what's taught in North Kingstown or Exeter. I have no idea. Parents really need to get much more involved, I think, and you're seeing this nationwide, in seeing what school boards are doing. A lot of them are doing the right thing, but obviously we know from some of the stuff we've seen, particularly you've seen the arguments going on in Virginia as we lead up to the Virginia election, not everywhere. And when there's smoke, there's fire. I can't tell you what's happening in a specific school board district, but when I hear enough people complaining about concepts or people talking about lesson plans they've seen that they object to, we got to look hard at that. So people need to get involved in that.
Yes, and North Kingstown is one of those districts where you may have seen in the press that there was a school committee meeting at which parents that were concerned wanted to speak out, and they stopped the meeting because one parent didn't have a mask on.
Yeah, I saw the video. It seemed like kind of a pretext to not talk about the subject matter because the mask issue is whole separate. But that looked to me as though they were trying to clear the room. But that's only from what I saw in the video. Sometimes there's more context.
I
You
understand.
don't see.
Well, so much for transparency and accountability, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Public officials should not be afraid to talk to people in public. I mean, that's why I wanted to show. That's what people should be afraid, not be afraid to do.
Let's move on to another topic. On October 15th, Governor McKee renewed his declaration of a COVID-19 state of emergency and defended his decision on the continued presence of the Delta variant of the virus. Now, General Law 30-15-9 says, and I quote, "The governor shall be responsible for meeting the dangers to the state and people presented by disasters." Section B of that law says, quote, "The state of disaster emergency shall continue until the governor finds that the threat or danger has passed or has been dealt with to the extent that emergency conditions no longer exist." But the law says, "No state of disaster emergency may continue for longer than 30 days unless renewed by the governor, and the General Assembly, by concurrent resolution, may terminate a state of disaster emergency at any time," end quote. We are being told that what is being called a COVID-19 vaccine and booster shot, we need to get it to be safe from and avoid spreading the virus. So is this really a disaster situation now? And why does the General Assembly stand on the sidelines and allow this governor and his predecessor to assume perpetual emergency powers?
So this is a long answer. First of all, right now, it's about the money, okay? Now, when COVID first hit back in March 2020, and we didn't know, none of us knew what we were dealing with, Governor Raimondo issued a state of emergency declaration like almost every other governor in the country did. That was one thing. Starting into the summer, once the legislature was clear we weren't going to meet again, and we had an election last year, so once we get past the summer, it's not going to happen. I started, and several of my colleagues, and some of the Democrats as well, I was very vociferous about this. Why are we still in a state of emergency? Why aren't we getting back into session, et cetera, et cetera? All right. Election comes, new legislature sworn in. We do finally get back into session. We do not terminate the state of emergency. I kept asking through the winter, why are we in a state of emergency? Finally, in the budget in June, there's a provision in the budget that changed, some of that statute you just read is a change we put in June. We terminated the state of emergency. Should have been done earlier, but it finally was done. I was told that the real struggle at this point is that the governor, using his emergency powers, believes he has the authority to spend money that really should be the purview of the legislature to do. So behind the scenes, what's been going on for the last several months is a power struggle over that. So and we're talking federal money, that federal money we still haven't spent. So we ended the state of emergency in June. Should have been earlier, but we finally did it. July goes by, and then was it August? I think he reinstituted it. And I know, I can tell you there was a public statement put up by the Speaker and the Senate President. It was, for them, a strongly worded statement. If you read between the lines, you can see they were not happy. I can tell you that privately they were less pleased than the statement itself. And the governor's been allowed to renew it a couple times already. We haven't been in session. We're not in session this time of year. It doesn't mean we can't come back, but we're not in right now. And I think the struggle is just about money. At this point, the whole idea of there being a COVID emergency in Rhode Island is ludicrous. Not to say COVID's not out there, but you don't have to deal with it as a society. We do. It's not an emergency. When people think about states of emergency, we're talking hurricanes, flooding, earthquake, war. You know what I'm saying? Tornadoes rip through a town. And the state of emergency is over within a short time. It's to give the governor some executive extra powers to deal with a crisis. COVID is no longer a crisis. It's now an endemic problem in society that's going to be with us forever. We need to start living like that. For better or for worse, that's what it is. It is not, however, an emergency. And it should be ended. The legislature should convene immediately and end it. But the reason we're not, I think, this is part of speculating a little bit, but I know more. The Democratic leadership in the House and Senate are having a little dance behind the scenes with the governor. They're both playing a little behind the scenes chicken. My guess is they're still negotiating over what those and once they reach an agreement, lo and behold, there'll be some budgetary thing put out. We'll end up probably passing it, and whatever it is, good or bad. I'm not saying I'll vote for it. I'm saying the legislature will pass it. And the emergency will miraculously come to an end. That's my prediction for the future for the next few months.
Well, your colleague on the Senate side, Republican State Senator Jessica De La Cruz, tweeted, quote, Why are we in a state of emergency? And in reference to the statewide school mask mandate by the governor, she cites maskless crowds at sports events as evidence that the COVID emergency is over. I guess you share her perspective on
Oh, I
this.
absolutely. I mean, yeah, I absolutely agree with her 100%. It's not just sporting events, by the way. I know she was talking. She's a Dallas Cowboy fan, so she's at the Patriots game with the Cowboys. But it's not just that. The last 2 Saturday nights, I've gone out to dinner. Once with my wife, and I took my parents out just this past Saturday. 2 different very good Italian restaurants up in northern Rhode Island. We have some excellent restaurants up there. I'm going to put a shout out in the show. Both times, they're both packed. Nobody wearing masks. I have no problem with this. I'm saying no one's wearing masks. Place is packed. And then our kids have to go wear masks in school. My son's friend came over Friday night. It was just he and I were home that night. My wife was away. And my son's friend came over. They're 16, 17-year-old. Came over. They got in a car. They drove over to another friend's house. Hung out for the Friday evening. I don't know, 4 or 5 of them. They weren't wearing masks, in the house. But when they go to school, they have to wear masks. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. It's absurd at this point.
So why does the governor issue a mask mandate for schools? Is this in response to some pressures from the teachers union, perhaps, or what?
I don't know about the union. I will tell you this. He didn't do it. And then his 2, at the time, primary challengers for the Democratic primary nomination came out and blasted him in public. And all of a sudden, he switched on a dime. So I would suggest it's purely political and it has to do with Democratic primary politics. That's what it has to do with.
And that would be Nellie Gorbea, Secretary of State, and Ira Magaziner, the state treasurer.
Seth Magaziner, yeah.
Yeah. I said that's his father.
Yeah.
Ira's his father.
So I think the governor, he wasn't going to do it. My take, I haven't talked to him, my take is he wasn't going to do it because there's no reason to do it. And he did it out of political pressure from his own party. So.
And speaking of money, the governor has released the McKee-Matos plan for distributing the $1 billion plus in federal COVID pandemic relief money. They say that this will set the stage for a revitalized Rhode Island by 2030, when both will be out of office, by the way. Now, have you looked at their plan, and do you expect the Democrat leadership in the legislature is going to let it happen this way?
Well, I have not looked at the plan yet. That said, any spending of, this is something you get unanimous opinion of the General Assembly on, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. State spending should be authorized and controlled by the legislature. That's our number one function. How it carries it out, that's up to the governor. He can propose, and then as they would say, he proposes, we dispose, et cetera. So I don't know what the legislature is going to do. Obviously, we have that money. When I say we need to spend it, I don't mean I want to spend frivolous spend money, but if we have money from the federal government, whatever I think of that policy from Washington, as a state legislator, if we have it, we should use it for the benefit of Rhode Islanders. That debate will go through the normal process in the General Assembly through finance. Whether it happens in a special session next month or it happens in the normal course in January, that's a big debate internally. But that's no different to me than any governor proposing a spending plan at the beginning of the year, as per usual, except it's a unique set of funds.
It seems to be that every issue of the Providence Journal contains a My Turn editorial from the Coalition Against This or the Alliance for That. Everybody's pleading that their special interest should be the one that's funded. And McKee-Matos' plan seems to focus on affordable housing, which is always an interesting point when housing prices rise. Everybody wants more affordable housing. So you haven't looked at the plan, but in the broadest sense, are you familiar with any of the priorities?
Well, affordable housing is something that the speaker put when this is his first year speaker, and that was one of his top priorities, and he's right to do that. I got to tell you something. I'm in the process of refinancing the equity line on my house. I cannot believe the value I just got in. It's not right. Like, I'm not going to complain, but it's not right. And it is very difficult. I have a 21-year-old son who just got an apartment. He just moved back from college. He had a heck of a time finding a place that was remotely affordable. And it is a real problem. Now, the real issue is, why is it a problem? And that's where the real political fights are. One of the reasons it's a problem is we can't build anything in this state, okay? You know the 195 land? You know why it's so empty? Because essentially the same cost to build in Providence, it costs the same to build in Providence as it does in Boston. Yet the rents in Boston are, dramatically higher because it's Boston. My office is in Boston. I'm in Boston 2-3 days a week. I park out in the Seaport District up there. I've watched it over the last decade explode. What used to be empty lots or rundown buildings has now turned into gleaming luxury this, luxury that. Whether they're going to get enough tenants, I don't know. That's a different question. But there's been construction going on up there for over a decade, booming construction in Boston. Every time I go up there and park, and I look at all the lots where the construction workers are parking, you know how many Rhode Island license plates I see? Because the workers drive up. Why isn't that happening in Providence? We have the land. Providence is a great place. I love Rhode Island. I wouldn't be here. But it costs the same. And if you're an investor with the money behind this stuff, you're not going to do it here when you can do it there. So that's problem number one. Number two, it's impossible in a lot of our towns to build anything. And, you know, nobody wants to hear it. Look, I live in a rural area. I don't want someone building a giant complex across the street either. But our zoning is an issue. It really is. Now, whether it should remain local controlled, that's a big fight. But we had a big fight in North Smithfield years ago over putting in I don't want to say low income, but like a subsidized housing. I'm going to say the word housing project is a bad connotation. Let's just say it was like condos. And it's not in the part of town exactly where I live, so I didn't have really dog in the fight, and I was just a resident. But you know what? It's pretty nice. You know what I mean? It's nice because you know why? It's not too big. It's fit to scale. It scales to the neighborhood. It's maybe, I don't know, 30 units, 40 units. The people are integrating into the neighborhood. The kids are in the schools, and everything's fine. But people don't like change. They like things to stay the way they are, which is all understandable. But you can't build anything. You can't afford anything to stay. And people who have kids, your kids are going to leave. I got one kid who's living in Georgia. My son who came back, you know, I'm glad he's back, but he had a hard time finding a place to live. He finally found a place in Providence. He can afford it with a roommate, but it's not easy. It's not easy. It's a real problem, but the solution's not simple either. I don't have any simple solutions. I'm just pointing out some things.
Well, a few years ago, there was a controversy about the state taking control over local planning and zoning authority to dictate perhaps that a certain percentage of housing be low income or affordable. And yet I noticed that in Providence, when Governor Raimondo was governor, that she would gleefully be turning over the first spadeful of dirt for these luxury apartments. None of them were designated as any part of.
There's two things. That push back in like 2015-ish, that was coming from the Obama administration through their HUD regulations. That was, and so it was sort of forcing the state planning board to the planning commission to look into overriding locals. That goes back to the issue, like who makes the decisions. The other thing too is, it's easy to say every town, under existing law, every town's supposed to meet 10%. I believe only 6 towns, I might be off, only 6 towns are at 10%. And they're not necessarily all the ones you would think. And then there's other towns that are like 5% or less. But then you look at it, we don't count mobile homes in the count. So for example, if you have a large trailer park, that's a lot of generally low-income housing. That should be counted, but it's not counted as statute. More importantly, you have to have the infrastructure. Even if you wanted to build some giant housing complex in the middle of Foster or North Smithfield or Borough, you can't. There's not. You got to have a sewer line. You got to have public transportation. You have to have things that don't exist. So how do you overcome all that? I mean, that's the issue. Obviously, some of our central cities have more low-income housing than the outer towns, but cities have always been like that too, you know. And then, well, anyway, I could digress, but you get my point.
No, well, the devil is in the details. It's great to have these overarching plans, but then when you try to implement them, you have to face the practical realities.
But the point is, though, the push that is being made to address the problem of affordable housing right now is a real one. It's going to derail our economy such as it is if we don't get a handle on it. How we do it, that's a big subject, but we do need to focus on it. I think everyone at the State House agrees on that.
I think, as I recall, the so-called McKee-Matos plan allocates $425 million to, quote, affordable housing, but I don't even know how that's defined.
And also, does that create some bureaucracy? I mean, I remember we had some bill, I forget what it was, we were discussing, it wasn't me, but I remember the discussion on the House floor. Do we need a housing czar? I'm so sick of the government. First of all, I hate that word. I'm sick of that. A czar is the emperor of Russia. It's not some government official in the United States. So stop using that word. But are we going to create another bureaucracy on this? We don't need that. We have enough public officials on the public dime doing stuff. What we need is changes to laws to make things, for example, easier to build. Talk to the builders. They can tell you. The Builders Association goes nuts. Trying to build a single family home in this state is almost impossible. I mean, I exaggerate, but it's hard just to get the permits.
Yeah, well, some of the requirements are far different today than they were 20 years ago. They have to be wrapped in Tyvek and many other things are added, and it makes it more expensive.
Expensive, and then you got to deal with. There's always the NIMBYism. Everyone's guilty of it. Every resident of Rhode Island, including myself, is guilty of NIMBYism. But we just need to face that fact.
We've had guests on this program from both political parties who believe, some would say fear, that this year's $13 billion plus budget on steroids will become the floor for future state budgets. And actually, I think the budget that was passed was about $3 billion more than the governor proposed to start with. Where do you stand on this? In effect, isn't the legislature already spending the COVID money?
We're spending some of it, yeah, some of the initial ones. The thing to remember about budgets in the government, I've said this for years, because when I first got elected, our budget was $6 billion, something like that. It was way too high then. And I remember being asked this question. I was a brand new legislator. I was on a program like this. What would you do? And I was like, I very naive, because you don't know. One thing about being elected to government, you'll learn a lot of things. No matter what your philosophy is, you'll learn a lot of things you didn't know before you get in there. You can't, unfortunately, just cut a budget easily, because most things a good chunk of our budget, this is true of every other state in the city, is locked in long-term responsibilities. If the state has a lease for something for 10 years, it's got to honor the lease. So you can't just go in and say, we've got a $10 billion budget, we're going to cut it by 10%, make it $9 billion, because the amount of money you can actually, maybe you could cut $1 billion, but it might be out of the same $2 billion pot. If you do that, you're going to have a riot in the streets because of the subject matter. So bottom line is, our budget didn't get to where it is overnight. And if you want to rein it in, it's not going to be reined in overnight. The difficulty with the budget we passed last year is how much of that sort of influx of federal money, and how much of this influx of federal money now are we going to use for a one-time thing, which is okay, that's kind of what it should be used for, versus creating a new, I don't want to say entitlement, but a new program or new something that gets a life of its own. Because as soon as you create an office of housing, for example, and you hire staff, those staff people aren't taking those jobs, the expectation to do it for 9 months, they're going to solve the problem and walk away. And next thing you know, they're going to want more people. So we'll go back 10 years from now, we'll have a housing office that employs 50 people who are on the pension system and everything else, and that drives all the other costs. So that's the problem. I don't know if that answers your question exactly.
Yeah, it does.
Yes, I am afraid that that's going to become a floor, but it doesn't need to become a floor. We can spend this federal money without it becoming a permanent problem. And if we don't do it that way, we're real fools. Because that federal money's not coming back every year. We know that.
Well, of course, the present administration in Washington is proposing a Build Back Better plan of who knows how many trillion by the time they get done. But
farce.
Many experts are saying that this is the real danger at the federal level and at the state level as you begin to, as you say, get used to this increased bureaucracy that's necessary to administer all these funds.
Yep.
And all these people have to work somewhere. So as you say, you go into a 10-year lease, and you're obligated, you're locking in a fixed nut every year. So it's a real danger. I hope people in Rhode Island realize what you're pointing out, and that this is truly a situation that has to be carefully watched, and the voters better take an interest in it.
Well, inflation's a real thing. It's a really serious problem in this country right now. It can be reined in, but inflation is a serious, serious problem. I was a small child in the 70s. I didn't know what inflation meant, but I knew that it was around then, it was bad. And I knew that we put the kibosh on it, starting with the Reagan administration, through the Clinton administration. I mean, this was they did a good job all the way through to, and now it's out of control in this country. Again, it's not too late to stop it. But if we start printing money off the printing press in Washington and creating new bureaucracies and new government programs, next thing you know, what are you paying for hamburger these days? What are you paying for cereal, for gasoline? Mm-hmm. Who cares if your budget's $13 billion if everything you spend, it costs twice as much as it did 2-3 years ago?
Well, I was an adult when we had what President Jimmy Carter called stagflation.
Yes, I remember that term. Yes.
So I lived through that, and a few other people on the staff have. And
it's what we have now.
Yep.
Yeah, it's what we have right now.
Yep. High unemployment and inflation together.
Exactly.
On October 19th, Governor McKee, joined by State Senator Sandra Cano and Representative Grace Diaz, signed into law a bill ensuring in-state tuition for Rhode Island students regardless of immigration status. Said Governor McKee, and I quote, "This legislation is not only about equity, but an increased access to higher education, which will benefit our community for years to come." Do you agree that undocumented immigrants should be allowed to have in-state tuition at CCRI, Rick, and
No,
URI?
they shouldn't. And here's the thing. When you talk about illegal immigration, it's a very tough subject because, first of all, number one, people on the left like to conflate opposition to illegal immigration with opposition to immigration, which is a complete lie. This country was built on immigrants. almost all of us here, unless you're full-blooded Native American, Indian, whatever, unless you're full-blooded, have a child of immigrants, whether they came 50 years ago, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, or 400 years ago. So let's cut to the chase. Immigration built this country. Immigrants should be welcome in this country. But we have a process for allowing people into this country. And we should not do anything that encourages other people to jump the line. And let's be clear, I don't blame people for jumping the line. One of my colleagues in the legislature's parents came here originally years ago. He told me this, illegally because they were fleeing oppression. I think the exact story, but his father came on, he got on a boat, one of the people came on rafts. Who can blame people? Wouldn't you want to come here? Why do you think the whole world's trying to come here? The problem is, and I don't know if it was Milton Friedman that said this, or it was attributed to him, but this old phrase, you can have open borders or a welfare state, but you can't have both. Well, we have an administration in Washington, and I think in this state, that wants both. You cannot have open borders and a welfare state. I welcome people to come here, but I want them to follow the process. So with that caveat, you shouldn't have public policies that provide incentives for people to break the law. And I know what's going to be thrown back is, well, what about kids? And it's always the issue, is the dreamers part. What do you do with people who were brought here as 2-year-olds? They don't know that they're illegal immigrants. They grew up here just like anybody else. It's a tough subject to deal with. And I think you need to find, in fact, we passed something in Rhode Island, I think a couple of years, I know we did, because I remember voting for it. I forget the details of it now, where we did some protections to give the dreamers some protections against deportation and that. That's fine, but we do policies like this, we are encouraging people to break the law. Are we going to enforce our immigration laws or are we not? That's the subject matter. So no, I don't support that, but I want people to have the full range of the picture, because this is one of those issues that gets people who are in favor of illegal immigration, they are out there, demonize anybody even suggest that they might be wrong, and it ticks me off.
We have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask you about the pending merger of the two largest hospital systems, in Kent and Rhode Island Hospital. Yeah. Are you in favor of this merger?
So that's a very broad question. And I don't know enough of the details of the merger to give you, I don't like answering yes or no like that, but I'm a little troubled by the fact that Partners up in Boston, Mass General and all that group, another good hospital group, tried to merge with Care New England, and Lifespan essentially used their influence to torpedo that. Secondly, Lifespan and Care New England are far and away the two biggest medical groups in the state. If they merge, where's the competition? I mean, there are a few hospitals. I mean, my local one in Woonsocket is
South County has a hospital in Westerly.
But most of the state will be under the Lifespan and Care New England, or whatever they're going to call it, I assume it'll be Lifespan. And when you have monopolies or near monopolies in any industry, I don't care what it is, bad things tend to happen. So my gut reaction is no, I'm not in favor of it. But mainly because I want to know what's going to happen if it doesn't happen. I'm concerned about what will happen to the Care New England, particularly if it doesn't happen. So,
are you going to run again next year?
Yes.
Okay. We have 1 minute left. Do you want to tell your voters why they should put you back in the legislature for another term?
I don't believe in term limits. I don't believe people should be in the legislature forever. I still think I do a good job representing my district. I've always felt like, obviously I can't make everybody happy, but I've always felt like in general I've represented the views of the majority of people in my district. If I didn't, I wouldn't have been elected in the first place. And I found that over the years, like, any issue, my opinion tends to dovetail with 60% plus of the population. Not always the same 60%. But I think I'm an effective advocate down there. I think the other thing, too, is experience does matter in the legislative body. Anybody who's first elected, no matter who they are, I didn't know what I was doing when I first got elected, I'll be honest. I learned quick, but I didn't know. And I have a good relationship with the leadership, Democratic leadership. I used to be the minority leader. So I bring a certain level of seniority, which is helpful. It is. It's helpful to effectuate things and get things done. So I'd appreciate the term.
I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to thank our audience for watching this edition of State of the State.